What if the CEO of a massive retail chain went undercover as a cashier and uncovered a shocking truth? When James Caldwell put on a name tag and stepped onto the store floor, he expected to see the business from a new perspective. But what he heard from a supervisor that night, it changed everything. And what happened next, no one saw coming. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us and inspires us to create even more engaging content. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. James Caldwell stood near the large glass window of Evermart's flagship store, watching the steady flow of customers coming and going. He had built this company from the ground up, believing that quality service and fair pricing could make Evermart a household name. But lately, troubling reports had been piling up on his desk, complaints about rude employees, dismissive behavior, and worst of all, elderly customers feeling unwelcome. James had read every report, but something didn't sit right with him. He knew that sitting behind a desk in the corporate office wouldn't give him the full picture. Numbers and statistics could only tell so much. If he wanted the truth, he had to see it for himself. So today, James wasn't here as the CEO of Evermart, dressed in a simple blue uniform, a name tag reading Mark pinned to his chest. He was just another new cashier starting his first shift. Inside, the store buzzed with the hum of conversations, beeping scanners, and the occasional squeak of shopping cart wheels against polished floors. The familiar sights and sounds comforted James. This was the empire he had built. But today, he wasn't here to admire it. Brandon, the evening shift supervisor, was barking orders near the front lanes. He was a stocky man in his early 40s with a permanent scowl and a voice that cut through the noise like a blade. His presence loomed over the employees, his words sharp and impatient. James quickly noticed how Brandon interacted with the staff. When a young cashier struggled to bag groceries fast enough, Brandon stepped in, not to help, but to criticize. "You're moving too slow. Customers don't have all day," he snapped, rolling his eyes. The cashier nodded quickly, fingers trembling as she rushed to keep up. Brandon didn't bother to check if she was okay. He had already moved on, his gaze scanning for the next mistake. James made his way to Register 8, where he would spend the evening shadowing another cashier before taking over on his own. As he settled in, a conversation nearby caught his attention. Brandon leaned against the counter, speaking in a low but clear voice to another employee. His words sent a chill through James. "These old folks clog up the lines, ask a million questions, and can't figure out how to use self-checkout. It's a waste of time serving them like they matter." The employee gave an uneasy chuckle but didn't respond. James felt his jaw tighten. He had read the complaints, but hearing the words spoken so casually was something else entirely. A few minutes later, a frail elderly man approached the self-checkout station. He moved carefully, gripping the cart handle for support. He placed a few canned goods on the scanning platform but hesitated, clearly unfamiliar with the touchscreen interface. James watched as the man glanced toward Brandon for assistance. Instead of helping, Brandon sighed loudly and folded his arms. "If you don't know how to use it, don't block the line," he muttered. The man's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, he looked as if he might turn away. James felt a slow burn rise in his chest. He had come here to observe, but now, he wasn't sure he could just stand by and watch. James had spent his career studying people. He could read their expressions, sense hesitation in their voices, and catch the small shifts in body language that spoke louder than words. And right now, as he continued to watch Brandon, it was clear that fear ruled this store, not just from the customers, but from the employees as well. It wasn't only the elderly who suffered under Brandon's reign. His own team walked on eggshells, careful not to do anything that might draw his ire. A young cashier named Emily stood at her register, her eyes darting toward Brandon every few seconds. She had just finished ringing up an older woman's groceries and was now gently helping the customer arrange her bags. Brandon spotted this from across the floor. His voice cut through the noise of the store. "That's not your job, Emily. If she wanted a personal assistant, she should have hired one." Emily flushed red and quickly withdrew her hands. The elderly woman looked embarrassed as well. mumbling an apology as she struggled to lift her bags. Brandon smirked. "If you don't want to hold up the line next time, maybe avoid shopping during rush hour." James felt a slow, simmering anger building in his chest. He had seen enough. He stepped forward just as the elderly woman fumbled with one of the smaller bags, nearly dropping a carton of eggs. Moving swiftly, James caught it before it hit the floor and handed it back to her. "I've got it, ma'am," he said warmly, scanning her remaining items and bagging them neatly before handing them over. The woman gave him a grateful smile and patted his hand. "Thank you, young man. Not many people take the time these days." Brandon was watching. His smirk faded into something sharper, more calculating. He crossed his arms and sauntered over, his voice dripping with mock amusement. "Mark, you're being a little too nice," he said. "You'll burn yourself out fast working like that." James met his gaze evenly. "I thought Evermart valued its customers." Brandon let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, we do," he said, his tone carrying an edge. "The right ones." James didn't blink. He had been in boardrooms filled with ruthless executives, faced investors who tried to manipulate him, and negotiated multi-million-dollar deals with people twice as cutthroat as Brandon. This wasn't intimidation, it was a test. Brandon leaned in slightly. "See, Mark, I decide who gets priority service here. Not the customers, not the store policy, me." James didn't flinch. He simply smiled, the kind of calm, measured smile that unsettled those who underestimated him. "Good to know," he said. A voice from behind made James turn. "Don't take it personally." It was Danny, another cashier who had been working quietly at the next register. He glanced around, making sure Brandon was out of earshot before lowering his voice. "He does this all the time," Danny murmured. "Everyone complains, but no one does anything because he's got connections. If you push back too hard, he'll find a way to make your life miserable." James took in Danny's expression, part frustration, part resignation. It was a look he'd seen before in corporate offices where toxic leadership went unchecked for too long. This wasn't just a bad employee. This was a symptom of a bigger problem. James had walked into this store expecting to deal with one man's bad behavior. But now, he saw the truth. Fixing this wasn't just about Brandon. It was about fixing the system that let people like him thrive. He would deal with Brandon. But this went deeper than one person. As James processed this revelation, a shadow loomed over him. Brandon was back, standing close, his voice low and taunting. "I don't know where you came from, Mark, but if you want to keep this job, I'd suggest keeping your mouth shut." James held his gaze for a moment. Then, instead of responding, he gave a small, knowing smile. Tomorrow, everything would change. The next morning, James Caldwell walked through the automatic doors of Evermart's flagship store. But this time, he wasn't wearing a cashier's uniform. Gone was the simple blue work shirt and name tag reading, Mark. Instead, he was dressed sharply in a tailored charcoal suit, his polished shoes tapping softly against the tile floor. A silver name badge on his chest bore his real title, CEO. For a moment, he paused near the front of the store, letting the moment sink in. The same fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The same beeping registers filled the air. But today, everything felt different. He wasn't here to observe anymore. He was here to act. A ripple of murmurs spread through the staff as they noticed him. Emily, standing behind a register, dropped the stack of receipts she had been organizing. Danny, who was loading bags into a cart, froze mid-motion, his eyes going wide. Other employees exchanged uneasy glances, whispering among themselves. "That's him," one muttered. "The new guy, he's the CEO?" Some looked relieved, others nervous. A few turned pale, clearly replaying everything they might have said in front of him the day before. James met Emily's gaze across the store. She hesitated for a split second, then straightened her shoulders. Danny, standing a few feet away, gave him a knowing nod. Neither of them had spoken much to James the previous night, but they had seen enough to understand what was coming. Across the store, Brandon remained oblivious. The shift supervisor strolled between registers, his usual smirk in place. He glanced at a teenage bagger struggling to keep up with a fast-moving checkout line and scoffed. "Pick it up, kid. I don't care if your hands are tired." You slow down the line. And you slow down my numbers." The young employee's face turned red as he scrambled to move faster. Brandon shook his head, muttering under his breath as he walked away. James clenched his jaw. Enough was enough. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the low hum of the store. "All employees, please gather at the front of the store. We're having a meeting, now." Heads turned. The murmur of customers grew quieter as employees hesitated, unsure if they had heard correctly. Brandon's smirk faltered for the briefest moment. Then, he straightened his posture and folded his arms. His confidence returning, he walked toward James at a leisurely pace, his expression filled with amusement. Well, he said, loud enough for others to hear. "So that's what this is about." He chuckled. "I should have guessed. Our little newbie was a big shot all along." James didn't react. He simply met Brandon's gaze. Unwavering. Brandon's smirk widened. "What's the occasion, boss? You here to give me a raise? Or maybe an award for outstanding leadership?" James remained calm. "I'd like every employee, and our elderly customers from last night, to join us in the break room. Now." The smirk on Brandon's face flickered. His eyes darted around, noticing the way employees were already moving, gathering toward the break room. Even a few customers, older men and women who had been brushed aside the previous evening, stood by curiously, their expressions cautious. Brandon's fingers curled into a fist at his side before he quickly released them. He let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Well, this should be interesting." Without another word, he turned and followed the others toward the back of the store. James took a slow breath and walked after them. It was time to set things right. The break room was packed. Employees stood pressed against the walls, some perched on chairs, others hovering near the doorway, unsure of what was about to happen. A few customers from the night before sat near the back, their expressions wary. The air felt thick, charged with an energy that made even the fluorescent lights hum a little louder. James stood at the front, his posture composed but firm. He scanned the room, taking in the mix of apprehension, curiosity, and tension etched into the employees' faces. Emily and Danny lingered near the corner, exchanging nervous glances. Others avoided eye contact entirely. They knew why they were here. Brandon leaned lazily against the wall, arms crossed over his chest. His smirk had returned, though it was thinner now, more forced. If he was worried, he didn't show it. Instead, he looked almost amused, as if this were just another minor inconvenience he would brush off. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small remote. With a single click, the screen mounted on the wall flickered to life. A grainy video appeared. Security footage. The room fell silent. On the screen, Brandon's voice rang out, clear and undeniable. There was a shift in the room, subtle, but unmistakable. Employees who had once kept their heads down now raised their eyes, watching as their boss's behavior was played back for everyone to see. The footage continued, showing Brandon ignoring an elderly man struggling at the self-checkout, then rolling his eyes at a woman asking for assistance. The final clip displayed him sneering at an older customer, his voice dripping with condescension. "If you don't know how to use it, don't block the line." A heavy silence followed. James turned to face the room. "This is the leadership you've been working under," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This is the example that's been set for how we treat our customers." A few employees shifted uncomfortably. Others exchanged glances but remained quiet. No one wanted to be the first to speak. Brandon let out a sharp laugh, breaking the silence. "That's it?" He straightened, shaking his head. "I'm being put on trial over a couple of edited clips? Let's be real here. I was just doing my job. We're a business, not a charity. If we waste time on every slow customer, the entire store suffers." James didn't react to the defiance. Instead, he met Brandon's gaze and asked, "Do you believe that belittling customers is part of doing your job?" Brandon scoffed. "I believe in efficiency. These people slow things down. And we all know it. I just have the guts to say what everyone else is thinking." A murmur rippled through the room. Emily, standing at the edge of the crowd, clenched her fists. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she stepped forward. "That's not true," she said, her voice clear despite the nervousness in her eyes. "No one wants to say anything because we're scared. If we stand up to you, we lose our jobs." Danny nodded in agreement. We've watched good people quit because they couldn't take it anymore. You create a toxic work environment, Brandon, and you know it. More murmurs. This time, a few more employees nodded, emboldened by the courage of their coworkers. The shift in the room was becoming undeniable. Brandon's smirk wavered, his jaw tightening. James let the moment settle before speaking again. Evermart was built on customer trust. Every person who walks through those doors, young, old, rich, poor, deserves respect, and any employee who undermines that, especially in a leadership position, has no place here. Brandon's posture stiffened. You think you can just fire me? His voice was lower now, edged with something close to panic. I have connections. You don't get to make that call on your own. James nodded. You're right. That's why I already spoke with the regional director, and they fully support my decision. The door opened, and 2 store security officers stepped inside. The room, which had been buzzing with quiet tension, fell dead silent. Brandon's eyes darted around, searching for someone, anyone, who might intervene. But no one did. Hand over your badge, James said. You're done here. Brandon's smirk finally vanished. His fingers twitched at his sides, his pride battling the reality in front of him. But he wasn't stupid. He knew there was no way out. He unclipped his name tag, tossed it onto the table, and let out a sharp breath. Then, without another word, he turned and strode toward the exit. The moment the door shut behind him, the tension in the room broke like a snapped wire. A few employees exhaled in relief. Others stood in stunned silence, as if still processing what had just happened. James looked out at the room, meeting their gazes one by one. Things are going to change around here, he said, and that starts today. The weight in his voice made it clear. This wasn't just about Brandon. This was about rebuilding something stronger, something better, and it was just the beginning. The store felt different after Brandon was gone. The oppressive weight of his presence had lifted, but something else lingered in the air, uncertainty. Employees moved through their shifts with a cautious optimism, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. Some stole glances toward the front office, whispering about whether James's bold decision would lead to real change or if things would quietly return to the way they had always been. James had seen this before. Change wasn't about removing one bad manager. It was about dismantling the culture that allowed people like Brandon to thrive in the first place. Danny, leaning against a checkout counter after his shift, voiced what many were thinking. People are relieved, sure, but they're also wondering if this is just a one-time thing. If the higher-ups still think like Brandon, what's stopping another guy like him from showing up? James nodded. Danny wasn't wrong. The problem wasn't just one toxic employee. It was the system that rewarded behavior like his. Later that evening, James sat in his office at Evermart's corporate headquarters, scrolling through his emails when one particular message caught his eye. The sender's name, Richard Langley. James opened it. Richard's tone was as polished as ever, but beneath the professional wording was a clear warning. I understand that you want to improve company culture, but let's not be too hasty. Brandon may have overstepped, but he also kept the store running efficiently. Decisions like this can create ripples that affect more than just one location. I suggest proceeding with caution. James leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The message was diplomatic, but the intent was clear. His actions weren't going unnoticed, and not everyone was happy about them. This wasn't just about Brandon. If Langley was reaching out personally, it meant the problem ran deeper than James had anticipated. The next morning, James returned to the store, determined to dig deeper. He found Emily stocking shelves and pulled her aside. I need to know more about how things worked under Brandon. Emily hesitated before speaking, her voice quiet but firm. It wasn't just him. There are other supervisors in different stores who act the same way. But no one does anything because they bring in numbers. If a store hits its profit targets, corporate doesn't ask questions. James frowned. So as long as they perform well financially, management looks the other way? She nodded. That's why Brandon never got in trouble, and why no one ever complained. Danny joined them, lowering his voice. I know people who quit because of it. Not just here, other locations. 2. It's the way things work. You keep up or you get out. James had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his stomach tighten. He wasn't just dealing with a few bad managers, he was facing an institutional problem. That night, as James was preparing to leave, an anonymous email arrived in his inbox. No name, no introduction, just a single attachment labeled, Internal Report. James clicked it open and scanned the contents. It was a breakdown of Evermart's customer segmentation strategy. A report detailing how the company categorized its shoppers. The language was professional, but the meaning was clear. Certain customers, particularly those who spent less or required extra assistance, were seen as inefficiencies. Employees were subtly encouraged to focus on high-spending patrons while minimizing interactions with those who might slow operations down. James set his laptop aside, rubbing his temples. Brandon had been a symptom, not the disease. Fixing this would take more than firing one man. It would require dismantling a mindset that had been ingrained in the company's operations for years. James wasn't sure how deep the problem went, but one thing was certain, he wasn't backing down. James Caldwell sat at the head of the conference table, his fingers lightly drumming against the polished wood surface. Across from him sat Richard Langley, the regional director, his expression unreadable, the corners of his mouth twitching with something close to amusement. Richard was the kind of man who thrived in the corporate world, not by innovation or leadership but by knowing exactly when to push and when to pull back. He wasn't a man who got his hands dirty directly, but James had no doubt that he had enabled managers like Brandon for years. The silence between them stretched. James had initiated this meeting, but he wasn't in a rush to speak first. He wanted to see how Richard played his hand. It didn't take long. Richard leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose in a way that suggested mild annoyance. James, I respect ambition. I really do. But let's not kid ourselves here. You might be CEO, but you and I both know who keeps this company running on the ground. James didn't flinch. And who would that be? Richard's lips curled into a knowing smirk. People like me. The ones making sure stores hit their numbers. The ones handling problems so you don't have to. He gestured vaguely. I assume this meeting is about Brandon. You got rid of him. Congratulations. But if you think one personnel change is going to fix anything, you're in for a rude awakening. James held his gaze. I'm not just talking about Brandon. I'm talking about the policies that have encouraged people like him. The ones that prioritize profit over people. I've seen the internal reports. The way we categorize customers. The way managers are rewarded for cutting corners instead of serving the community. Richard let out a short laugh, shaking his head as if James had said something naive. James, we're not a charity. Evermart isn't in the business of handholding. We're in the business of making money. The system works because it ensures efficiency. You remove that structure, and you're looking at chaos. James remained calm, his voice steady. What I see is a system that's been manipulated to justify treating certain customers as an inconvenience. That's not efficiency. That's negligence. Richard sighed, tapping a finger against the table. Look, I get it. You're new to this level of management, and you want to leave your mark. But let me give you some free advice. Be careful where you step. His voice dropped slightly, the easygoing tone fading, because when you start messing with things that have been in place for years, you tend to make enemies. The board doesn't like uncertainty. Investors don't like uncertainty. If you push too hard, you might find yourself on the wrong side of a decision you don't control. James recognized the warning for what it was. Richard wasn't threatening him outright, but the message was clear. There would be consequences if he didn't back down. James sat forward slightly. I appreciate the advice, but I'm not backing down. For the first time, Richard's smirk faded. His jaw tightened, his fingers flexing slightly on the table. Then I guess we'll see what happens, Richard said, standing up, without waiting for a response. He adjusted his suit jacket and strode toward the door. James didn't stop him. He didn't need to. The moment Richard walked out, James already knew. This wasn't just about internal policies anymore. He had just declared war on a system designed to protect people like Richard, and now Richard would do everything in his power to protect himself. That night, as James was leaving the office, an anonymous email landed in his inbox. The message was brief. You're not the first to try fixing this. But if you're serious, I can help. A location was attached, a small cafe on the outskirts of town. A time, 9:30 p.m. No name. James stared at the screen for a long moment. He knew better than to blindly trust an anonymous source. But something about the message felt different. This wasn't a trap, it was an opportunity. So later that evening, James pulled into the dimly lit parking lot of a quiet cafe. The place was nearly empty. The kind of establishment where people went to be left alone. Inside, a woman in her 50s sat at a corner booth, stirring a cup of coffee. She looked up as James approached. Her expression unreadable. "You're persistent," she said, nodding toward the seat across from her. "That's good. You're going to need it." James sat down. "And you are?" The woman took a sip of coffee before answering. "Karen Shaw, former regional manager for Evermart." James stiffened slightly. He had read that name before. In old internal reports. She had been with the company for over a decade before suddenly resigning 5 years ago. At the time, it had been framed as a personal decision. But something about the way she looked at him now told a different story. Karen studied him carefully before speaking again. "I know what you're trying to do. I tried, too." James leaned in. "And?" Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "And I was forced out. Not because I was wrong, but because I started asking the wrong questions to the wrong people." She reached into her bag and slid a flash drive across the table. "That's every email, every report, every memo that proves what's really been happening. The way managers like Richard have protected people like Brandon. How they've covered up complaints, manipulated performance numbers, and kept corporate off their backs." James picked up the flash drive, weighing it between his fingers. "This is what you were fired for?" Karen let out a short laugh. "No, I was fired because I wanted to fix it." She leaned forward, her gaze sharp. "You want to change this company, James? Then you need to understand, you're not up against bad policies. You're up against people who have built their careers on making sure those policies stay exactly the way they are." James exhaled slowly. He had suspected as much. But now, it was real. He wasn't just fighting for better management. He was fighting against a machine designed to resist change. And the real battle was only beginning. Karen Shaw sat across from James, her fingers idly tracing the rim of her coffee cup. The dim light of the cafe cast long shadows across her face, making the exhaustion in her eyes more pronounced. It wasn't the kind of tiredness that came from lack of sleep. It was the kind that settled into a person after years of fighting a losing battle. "I used to believe in this company," Karen said, her voice even but laced with something deeper. "When I first started, Evermart was about more than just squeezing every last penny out of people. We were building something that helped communities. But then the culture changed." James listened intently, letting her words sink in. She leaned forward slightly, her expression hardening. "I saw it happening in my own stores. Policies shifting, pressure increasing. It started small, cutting back on extra cashiers during non-peak hours, encouraging self-checkout over personal assistance. But then the numbers game got worse. Customer service wasn't about helping people anymore. It was about deciding who was worth helping." James frowned. "And that's when you started pushing back." Karen gave a humorless chuckle. "Yeah, I raised concerns, suggested adjustments. I even presented a plan to balance efficiency with real customer care." She shook her head. "But the moment I started questioning the system, I became a problem. Richard Langley and the other regional directors shut me out of meetings. My proposals disappeared before they ever reached corporate. Eventually, I was told I didn't fit the culture anymore. They gave me a choice: resign quietly or be fired for insubordination." James felt a slow burn of anger settle in his chest. He had suspected Langley's involvement ran deeper, but hearing it firsthand made it personal. Karen reached into her bag and pulled out a small external hard drive. Sliding it across the table, "Everything's on here," she said. "Emails, financial reports, internal memos, proof that Langley and his people have been manipulating policies for years to maximize profits at the expense of customers and employees alike." James picked up the device, feeling its weight in his palm. This wasn't just evidence, it was a roadmap of everything rotten beneath Evermart's surface. That night, back in his office, James plugged the hard drive into his laptop. The screen filled with folders, each labeled with dates and keywords. He opened the first file and began reading. The deeper he went, The worse it got. The internal scoring system was the first red flag. Customers weren't just tracked by purchase history, they were ranked. Those who spent more were given priority service, while those who required extra help were flagged as low value. Employees were subtly directed to focus on the former and ignore the latter whenever possible. Then there were the performance reports. Store managers who enforced these unspoken rules saw promotions and bonuses. Those who resisted saw their stores suddenly struggle, staffing cuts, budget reductions, increased scrutiny, complaints from employees about unethical treatment, buried, workers who spoke up, quietly reassigned or pressured to leave. James exhaled slowly, closing his laptop for a moment. This wasn't incompetence, it was deliberate. A chime from his phone broke the silence. He reached for it, frowning as he read the message. No number, no name, just a single line. You're going too far, James. Don't make yourself a target. James stared at the screen, his mind working quickly. Someone knew what he was doing. Someone who wanted him to stop. But instead of fear, James felt something else, determination. He wasn't stopping, not now. He had everything he needed to bring this into the light, and he had every intention of doing just that. James knew that taking on Richard Langley and the system he upheld wouldn't be easy. If he wanted to dismantle the toxic culture within Evermart, he couldn't do it alone. He needed the right people, ones who understood both the legal and public relations aspects of a corporate battle. The first call he made was to Eleanor Park, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney known for her work in consumer protection cases. She had spent years going after corporations that exploited their customers. And if anyone could help him build a solid legal case, it was her. When he arrived at her downtown office, Eleanor was already reviewing the files he had sent ahead. She barely looked up as he sat across from her desk. "You've got something big here," she said, flipping through a stack of printed documents. "If even half of this is legitimate, Evermart could be looking at serious liability, discrimination, fraud, maybe even wrongful termination cases from former employees." James nodded. "I want this handled internally first. If we bring it straight to the public, it'll turn into a media circus. But if the board refuses to act, I need a backup plan." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, studying him. "That's where I come in." James knew what she was asking. "I want to give them the chance to fix this the right way. But if they don't, I want to be ready to take legal action." Eleanor gave a slow nod. "All right, I'll start drafting the necessary complaints. But you're going to need more than legal leverage. You need public pressure." James had already thought of that. His next stop was the city's most respected financial publication, where he arranged a meeting with Ryan Carter, an investigative journalist with a reputation for exposing corporate corruption. Ryan listened intently as James laid out everything: the internal reports, the manipulated policies, the way management had systematically ignored complaints in favor of boosting profits. When James finished, Ryan let out a low whistle. "You're not just talking about a bad manager here. You're talking about an entire system built to reward unethical behavior." James met his gaze. "I need to handle this carefully. I'm going to present this to the board first. But if they try to sweep it under the rug, I want you ready to break the story." Ryan nodded. "Understood. Just keep me in the loop." With both legal and media strategies in place, James prepared for the real challenge, facing the board of directors. A week later, he walked into the Evermart headquarters, a thick binder of evidence tucked under his arm. The boardroom was filled with executives, all watching him carefully. Richard Langley sat near the center, his expression unreadable. James wasted no time. He laid out everything: customer ranking systems, buried complaints, toxic management practices. As he spoke, he saw the shifting expressions in the room. Some members looked concerned, others skeptical, but it was Richard who finally spoke up, his tone calm but laced with disdain. "This is an overreaction," Richard said smoothly. "Every retail business has efficiency models. We're simply streamlining operations to maximize profits." James kept his voice steady. "You're not streamlining. You're deciding who matters and who doesn't. That's not efficiency, that's discrimination." A few murmurs broke out among the board members. But Richard wasn't finished. He leaned forward, a slow smile creeping onto his face. "I thought you might pull something like this," he said, reaching into his own stack of documents. Which is why I came prepared. He slid a folder across the table. James opened it, and felt his stomach tighten. It was a service policy document. One with his own signature at the bottom. Richard's voice was smooth as he addressed the room. 5 years ago, our dear CEO here approved a customer service restructuring plan. A plan that allowed for prioritization based on spending habits. That, my friends, was the foundation for what we have today. Silence fell over the boardroom. James stared at the paper, his own signature staring back at him. He remembered signing this policy. But back then, it had been presented as a simple efficiency adjustment. He had never imagined it would be twisted into something so destructive. Richard's smirk deepened. You want to be the hero, James? Fine. But let's not forget that you helped build this system. So tell me, are you here to fight against me? Or against your own mistakes? James swallowed hard, realizing that this battle wasn't just against Richard. It was against the very decisions he had once believed were the right ones. The boardroom was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. James sat at the long mahogany table, his shoulders squared, his hands folded in front of him. Across from him, Richard Langley leaned back in his chair, looking almost relaxed as the document with James's signature lay open between them. William Foster, the chairman of the board, adjusted his glasses and tapped his fingers on the table. He had been in the corporate world long enough to recognize when a fight was unfolding in front of him. And right now, this wasn't just a discussion about policy, it was a power struggle. James, William said, his voice measured, if you signed off on this policy years ago, why the sudden change of heart? James met his gaze evenly. Because I didn't know what it would become. I believed we were streamlining operations, improving efficiency, not creating a system that dehumanized our customers. Richard let out a quiet chuckle and turned to the rest of the board. You see what's happening here, don't you? James is trying to play the hero. He wants to act like he's swooping in to fix a problem he helped create. He shook his head, his voice dripping with condescension. It's a nice story, but let's be honest, he's doing damage control. Nothing more. James ignored the jab. He knew he couldn't afford to get defensive. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents, spreading them out for the board to see. I understand why you have doubts, he said, keeping his tone steady. That's why I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm asking you to look at the facts. He flipped to the first report. This is internal correspondence from regional managers, explicitly encouraging store supervisors to deprioritize certain customers based on spending habits. It's not about efficiency, it's about exclusion. He moved to the next document. Here are emails from employees who raised concerns about these policies, only to be ignored or forced out. Finally, he held up a statement from Karen Shaw. And this is a first-hand account from a former regional manager who was pressured to resign because she tried to change this toxic culture. The room was tense. Some board members shifted in their seats. Others exchanged glances. The weight of the evidence was impossible to ignore. William leaned forward, scanning the documents. He wasn't a man who made quick decisions. And James knew this would take time. I'll need to review these thoroughly before making any determinations, William said finally. We'll reconvene once I've had the chance to verify your claims. James nodded. It wasn't the outright victory he had hoped for. But it was enough, for now. He had bought himself time. But as the board members began to disperse, Richard didn't move. He stayed in his seat, watching James with a knowing smirk. Once the room had mostly cleared, Richard spoke in a low voice. That was cute, James. Really? He leaned forward slightly. But you and I both know this isn't about policies. It's about power. And you just made a lot of enemies in that room. James kept his expression neutral. I'm not interested in power. I'm interested in fixing this company before it collapses under its own weight. Richard chuckled again, shaking his head. Idealism is expensive, and you're about to find out just how much it costs. With that, he stood and strolled toward the exit, pausing just long enough to add, "Oh, and I wouldn't get too comfortable if I were you. The board might need time to review. But I won't. Enjoy your little reprieve while it lasts." James sat still, watching Richard leave. He had expected pushback. He had expected Richard to retaliate. What he hadn't expected was the uneasy feeling settling in his gut, the sense that Richard was already making his next move. That night, as James left Evermart headquarters, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He told himself it was paranoia, that Richard was just trying to rattle him. But when he reached his car, a single piece of paper was tucked under the windshield wiper. It wasn't a note. It was a printout of his schedule for the next 3 days. Meetings, locations, times, all accurate. James's grip tightened on the paper. This wasn't just corporate maneuvering anymore. Richard was sending a message. And James had no doubt that the real fight was just beginning. James sat in his office, staring at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The weight of the past few days settled on his shoulders. But his mind was clear. He had tried to fight this battle internally, trusting that the board would act in the company's best interest. But now, he saw the truth. Evermart's leadership wasn't built on integrity. It was built on alliances, backroom deals, and a carefully constructed illusion of ethics. If he wanted real change, he couldn't rely on the board. He had to take this fight public. His phone buzzed. Ryan Carter's name flashed on the screen. James answered. "We're moving forward," he said without preamble. Ryan didn't sound surprised. "I was wondering when you'd finally say that." James leaned back in his chair. "I have everything you need. The internal ranking system, the emails between regional managers, the performance reports rewarding supervisors who prioritized profits over people." Ryan exhaled sharply. "You realize once this goes live, there's no turning back, right? Evermart will have to respond. And Richard Langley isn't the type to go down quietly." James knew that. He had spent enough time around men like Richard to understand how they operated. There would be threats, retaliation, possibly even legal action. But the moment this story hit the press, public pressure would shift the balance of power. The board would have no choice but to act. Still, timing was everything. "We're not publishing just yet," James said. "I'm holding a press conference first." Ryan paused. "A press conference? I need to control the narrative. If this goes out as an exposé first, Evermart will have room to spin it as exaggerated. But if I'm the one standing in front of the cameras, owning the truth, they won't be able to dismiss it." Ryan chuckled. "You really want to make a show out of this, huh?" James smiled slightly. "I want to make sure there's no way for them to bury it." That evening, James finalized the details. He reached out to current and former employees who had been forced out under Richard's leadership. He wanted real voices, people willing to stand beside him when the truth came out. Some hesitated, afraid of retaliation, but others, like Karen Shaw, agreed without question. This should have happened years ago, she told him. James knew she was right. The next morning, as he reviewed final preparations, an envelope arrived at his office. No return address, no sender, just his name on the front. Inside was a letter from Evermart's legal team, a formal warning demanding that he cancel the press conference, citing potential defamation and breach of company confidentiality. The language was careful, but the message was clear: if he went through with this, they would come after him. James wasn't surprised. He was about to put Evermart's leadership under public scrutiny, and Richard Langley would do everything in his power to stop him. Later that evening, James was reviewing final details when his assistant rushed into the office. Her face pale. "You need to see this." She handed him a tablet, the screen displaying a leaked internal email. It was from Richard Langley to his network of regional managers. "If this continues, we will remove him, find ways to discredit him, question his leadership, make him the problem. He will not dictate how this company operates." The document was already spreading online. Customers, employees, and even investors were reacting. Hashtags demanding Richard's resignation were gaining traction. News outlets were picking up the leak. James read the email again, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. Someone inside Richard's circle had leaked this. Someone who wanted to see him fall. James didn't know who the insider was. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. Richard Langley had just lost control of the narrative, and James was ready to deliver the final blow. James watched the chaos unfold from his office. Evermart was burning, not in the literal sense, but in the way companies burned when the public turned against them. The leaked email had spread like wildfire, picked up by every major news outlet. Social media was flooded with outrage. Customers vowing boycotts. Employees sharing their own horror stories about the company's toxic culture. Evermart had spent decades crafting an image of reliability and trust. Now, in a matter of hours, that image was crumbling. James knew this was the moment to strike. He called an emergency meeting with the board. When he entered the conference room, the tension was palpable. The directors sat stiffly in their seats, their expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed panic. William Foster, the chairman, rubbed his temples as if already exhausted from what was about to happen. Richard Langley, however, sat calmly. If he was nervous, he didn't show it. James didn't waste time. He placed a folder on the table. This company is at a crossroads. Evermart is facing a public reckoning. And we have two options. Either we act now and show the world we're willing to fix this, or we let it spiral out of control until there's nothing left to salvage. A few board members exchanged glances. But Richard scoffed. This isn't a reckoning, he said smoothly. This is manufactured outrage, fueled by opportunists like James who want to make themselves look good at the company's expense. James didn't rise to the bait. He flipped open the folder. Evermart's stock is already dropping. Major investors are asking for explanations. If we don't take action now, we'll be dealing with more than just bad press. We'll be dealing with a financial disaster. One of the directors, an older woman named Evelyn Grant, cleared her throat. What exactly are you proposing, James? James met her gaze. A full-scale reform, starting with the immediate termination of Richard Langley and any executives involved in unethical practices. A murmur swept through the room. Richard let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. This is personal, isn't it? You don't care about fixing the company. You just want me gone. James leaned forward. You made this personal the moment you decided customers weren't worth serving unless they lined your pockets. You made it personal when you buried complaints and punished employees who spoke out. And now, the whole world knows it. Richard opened his mouth to respond. But before he could, the doors swung open. Karen Shaw stepped inside. She wasn't alone. Beside her stood a man James recognized immediately, Daniel Whitmore, one of Evermart's regional directors. A man who had once been one of Richard's closest allies. Karen placed a USB drive on the table. I thought you all might want to hear something before making any decisions. William Foster gave her a wary look but motioned for her to continue. Karen plugged the drive into the conference room's speaker system. The recording crackled to life. Richard's voice filled the room. I don't care about the fallout. We can spin this. Customers forget scandals within months. If we have to sacrifice a few scapegoats, so be it. But if James keeps pushing, we make him the problem. We pull his financials, dig into his past. Everyone has dirt. We just have to find his. The silence that followed was deafening. James turned to Richard, watching as the man's confidence finally cracked. His face paled, his fingers tightening around the arms of his chair. This was taken 3 days ago, Karen said. Richard wasn't planning to fix anything. He was planning to bury the truth. A few board members shook their heads in disgust. Others, who had been on the fence, now looked at Richard as if seeing him for the first time. Evelyn Grant was the first to speak. I vote for Richard Langley's immediate removal. One by one, the votes followed. Even Richard's former supporters abandoned him, realizing he was now a liability. William Foster gave a slow nod. Richard, you're dismissed. Effective immediately. Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You think this fixes anything? His voice was low, furious. You think taking me out changes the system? James met his glare. No, but it's a start. Security arrived to escort Richard out. And for the first time in years, Evermart was free of his control. But James knew this wasn't over. The company still had a long way to go to earn back the trust it had lost. And he was ready for the fight ahead. The Evermart headquarters felt different in the days following Richard Langley's removal. There was a shift in the air, an uneasy blend of relief and uncertainty. Some employees walked taller, hopeful that change was finally coming. Others, particularly those who had benefited from the old system, moved cautiously, waiting to see what would happen next. James sat in the executive boardroom, looking out over the city skyline. He had won a battle, but the war was far from over. Now came the hardest part, rebuilding. He stood and faced the group gathered before him. Regional managers, department heads, legal counsel. Some had been loyal allies in the fight against Richard. Others had only changed sides when they realized the tide was turning. "We're making changes," James announced, his voice steady. Not just symbolic gestures, but real, structural reforms. A few exchanged wary glances, but no one dared speak. "The customer ranking system is gone," James continued, "effective immediately. Every customer, regardless of how much they spend, will receive the same level of service." There were no protests. The leaked emails had turned public opinion so fiercely against Evermart that no one wanted to be seen defending the old policies. "We're also restructuring management training. Every store supervisor, every regional director, will go through mandatory leadership courses focused on ethical decision-making and customer service." One of the older managers cleared his throat. "And how exactly do you plan to enforce this?" James didn't hesitate. "We're implementing a new oversight committee, anonymous reporting channels for employees, third-party audits, and any manager caught violating these standards will be removed, no exceptions." The silence in the room wasn't just from compliance. It was from shock. For years, Evermart had been ruled by unspoken rules, favoritism, backroom deals, looking the other way. Those rules were being rewritten. And some people didn't like it. But James didn't care. He wasn't here to make them comfortable. The fallout. Richard Langley had disappeared from public view. But he wasn't out of trouble. Investigators were already digging into his financial dealings. And it was only a matter of time before formal charges were filed. Several regional directors who had worked closely with Richard were quietly let go. Their records flagged for questionable practices. Others, realizing which way the wind was blowing, resigned before they could be pushed out. Not everyone was pleased with James's reforms. Some members of the board, particularly those who had once aligned with Richard, were uneasy about the sweeping changes. At a private meeting, they proposed restructuring the CEO's role, reducing his decision-making power to prevent what they called overreach. James knew what this was. It was their way of saying, "You won this round, but don't get comfortable." The choice. Standing in his office late one evening, James let himself feel the exhaustion for the first time. He had spent months fighting to fix a system that was designed to resist change. And even now, with Richard gone and policies being rewritten, he knew his position was still precarious. He had two options. He could stay, keep pushing, keep fighting, but it would be a long road, filled with resistance at every turn. Or he could walk away, leave Evermart behind and let someone else carry the torch. His reputation would be intact, his legacy secure, but the company's future? That would be out of his hands. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. His assistant entered, a serious expression on her face. "This was left for you." She placed a plain envelope on his desk before stepping out. James picked it up, unfolding the single sheet of paper inside. No signature, no return address, just one line. "You won this time, but don't think the system will change so easily." James exhaled slowly. He had expected resistance. But this was something else. A warning, a reminder. He looked out over the city, the lights stretching far into the distance. Evermart was only one battle. There were others, bigger ones, deeper ones. And whoever had sent that note, they had just given him another reason to stay. James placed the letter down and straightened his tie. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. In the end, James Caldwell didn't just expose a toxic work culture. He proved that true leadership means standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. His journey shows us that real change starts from within. And sometimes, it takes seeing the truth firsthand to make a difference. But the question remains, how many other companies are hiding similar secrets? What would you do if you were in James's shoes? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Undercover Truths for more eye-opening stories.